So this is my presentation on urban agriculture and how we can sustainably feed the world and solve a lot of the problems that current agriculture poses for us today. So I wanted to just give like a blanket definition on urban agriculture. The Environmental Protection Agency defines it as a part of the local food system where food is locally produced within an urban area and marketed to consumers within that area. So just like a really big focus on having it be local and close by so everyone has access to it. So a typical urban agriculture farm or like food stand will sell fruits, vegetables, animals like chickens, small things like that. Um, they also do like urban beekeeping, which helps with the pollination of any crops grown like on rooftops and stuff. There's aquaculture and non-food products like seeds and flowers as well. And the typical locations, which I will go more into later on, but they're found on backyards, rooftops, balconies, a lot of vacant lots like brown fields, or like on the roadside, pretty much just anywhere where there's space and you can make it growable, you can have an urban garden there. So, a little brief history on urban agriculture. It's not a new form of farming. It was originated in 3500 BC, where Mesopotamian farmers would set up like little gardens in the developing cities there to help sustain themselves. Um, and in the 1800s, London was first becoming more industrialized, and as a result, there was a lot of slums. So the city and a lot of urban reformers were working to implement a lot of these farms just as a way for people to self-sustain and improve the conditions of the people living there. And one of the first Salvation Army programs was a farm colony, um, just one of those urban farms that help the people just take better care of themselves and get the nutrition that they need. Um, and in the 1930s, we were seeing more of war efforts, urban gardens related to that. They're called victory gardens. There's some in Chicago dedicated to World War II efforts. And in World War I, the urban gardens actually grew 36% of all of the relief food given. So, and there are 33,000 gardens over 1,800 acres in Chicago. Um, and some issues regarding urban agriculture today, which I'll go more into again, but there are conflicts between the um, like farm designers, if it's especially if it's like privately owned or it's part of an organization, so they might not know the residents in the community's needs. They might be growing things that they don't want or things that are like culturally not a part of their diet, like if you can't eat pork or things like that for religious reasons. So I'll go into that more, but also not everyone in crisis areas would be able to participate in farming, especially if it's backyard farming. Um, so like places like say Detroit, or like the south side of Chicago, for instance, as well. These areas, they are what's considered time poor areas. So they're, working or things like that, trying to bring money into the house, and they don't really have a lot of time to dedicate to gardening. So these are just some pictures of the urban farming developments in London on the left, and then on the right is the Detroit gardens that were dedicated to the war efforts. So some important figures in urban development or urban farming development. Peter Kropotkin, however you say that, was an anarchist Russian prince in the 1800s. He was actually imprisoned for his activism in Russia. He wrote a lot of pamphlets and books and resources on how to um, build your own garden and support your community in that way. His books were focused on alleviating poverty and hunger through sort of these farming efforts, and he believed those to be caused by capitalism as well. Um, and he influenced many other urban city planners like Ebenezer Howard. He was an urban planner based in England in the 1900s, and he was very influenced by the work that Kropotkin did. Um, and he also created the Garden City movement in London and wrote a book called Tomorrow, Peaceful Path to Real Reform, which focused on alleviating poverty and sort of this vision of a slum-free London. So some of the current agriculture practices of today, um, it has a huge environmental impact. There are, just these huge monoculture fields where pesticides and fertilizers are used on them, um, and heavy machinery, which all causes soil depletion, erosion, water waste, and contamination. The pesticides and fertilizers contribute to like dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico with the runoff, um, and it also leads to increased greenhouse gases and global warming. Um, it contributes between 20 and 33% of all global greenhouse gases. Again, just due to the methods of farming. And it uses about 70% of the world's freshwater reserves and 40% of the total land mass. So I also have like a typical dairy carbon footprint here. Um, and it obviously, it shows how you need housing for the cattle, you need land to grow the food for them, the fertilizers, the manure, the electricity, all of that, and then also like the methane from the cows. But it's 1,200 carbon emission equivalents, um, and there's also massive land waste involved. So the average diet of meat and dairy requires 18 as much land than if you just were eating plant-based, which urban agriculture can cater more towards that. And that also brings that down, the carbon emissions from plant-based diet as well, just with the amount of land used. So in order to keep feeding the world's population in the way that we are today with the current practices, we need to convert land to about the size of South America. Um, and in contrast to that, like to feed a person on a more plant-based diet would require 1/6 of an acre. So reducing commercial farming means no more monoculture crops, like just fields of only corn. Um, and that leads to more diversity in our foods, more reforestation, and just less environmental destruction overall. So, going off of the reforestation, there is huge deforestation in Brazil's rainforests, the Atlantic forest, or just their forests in general. Their Atlantic forest is now 7% of its original size, and this is due to sugarcane um, plantations. They basically tear down sections of the forest to grow the sugarcane monoculture crop. And they export about 28 million tons of sugar, so it's not even really feeding the population. It's just being exported out to other countries, like say to the US or China, places like that. And growers will need to cultivate about 50% more land by 2050 to meet the projected demand. So there's also the maldistribution of their food resources. So we are growing enough food right now to feed between 12 and 15 billion people, but just the way that we distribute it is not efficient and it's not sustainable. So 1/3 of this food is wasted, and 1/3 also becomes animal feed, as I was talking about. And 50% of all legumes and grain are grown to feed the livestock. So obviously this is just like a massive land waste, and it's a lot of energy and resources needed to feed something else, to feed ourselves, and all of it's grown on massive fields, and just the land waste in that. I have a graphic down here beside like the other picture, which is just a pile of squashes and things like that next to this giant field that they're just throwing away. But the graphic beside that, all 50% of our habitable land is dedicated to agriculture, and only 37% is dedicated to forests. So overpopulation is also an issue. The global population is estimated to be around 8.6 billion by 2030, and it's just going to keep growing and growing and growing. We've tried to make some efforts to reduce it, but ultimately we will just keep continuing until we can't anymore. And then, so basically, going on the current trend of our population size coupled with the current agriculture model that we're using, it disproportionately affects the poor countries and those living in urban spaces, especially like lower income people. 1 billion people on the planet are starving, and 82% of starving children live in countries where the feed is given to livestock, and the livestock is given to feed people in more developed countries. I have the 2016 Global Hunger Index, and you can see like places like Africa, and like I said, Brazil and everything like that, they're growing our food and we're getting food from these places. Africa is very reliant on agriculture as well, but they're also in experiencing the most hunger. So that is a huge issue that urban agriculture seeks to sort of fix. Okay, I'm not sure why my picture isn't loading, but so by 2050, 70% of all world's population will live in urban areas, and it's due to urban migration, and also farmers being run out by those larger commercial monocrop farms. And the USDA defines, so obviously, like the higher populations in cities leads to, more resources being needed, but also leads to a lack of food security. So the USDA defines food security as the readily available of nutritionally adequate, safe foods, and an assured ability to acquire acceptable foods in socially acceptable ways. So in 2010, 14.5% of people in the US experienced food insecurity, and of the 45 million people, 16 million were children, and 6 million were older slash elderly adults, so more of the vulnerable populations. And why is this? It's because of like a huge reason, not the only reason, but is a lack of access to food. So obviously, like I said, this affects lower income urban neighborhoods more. There's a high number of fast food eateries, especially because these neighborhoods tend to be more time poor, as I was saying. So they're like the convenience of fast food is just, it's easily available to them, so it's instant food security in that sense, but even though it's not nutritious. And there's also a lack of grocery stores. They don't tend to want to put their stores into an area where of that customer base, like lower income areas. They're not going to spend as much money in a grocery store if you put it in more of a higher income area, obviously. So they just don't have a lot of the same access as other people do. So some of the urban farming methods, I'll be going over. The pictures on the left are a rooftop farm, and then there is the vertical farming as well, which is all soilless farming, and then there's backyard farming, on the top right, and then community or nonprofit farms. So vertical farming is when you use multi-story buildings to grow crops with these greenhouse LED lights. You can see the purple lights at the bottom. Um, so it was invented by Gilbert Ellis Bailey, and it works to reduce agricultural sprawl and reduce the need for these huge monoculture lands, and it emphasizes maximizing the land use. So it can produce about 4 to 6 soil-based acres, um, which is obviously a huge reduction compared to what we have now. So the benefits of this, it doesn't require long distance transportation. It's a controlled indoor environment, so we could have foods all year round. They don't need to be seasonal. Um, so it's easier to also address like nutritional needs in communities that are lacking it. And it uses drip irrigation, hydroponics, all these fancy technologies, and it works to reduce topsoil erosion. They recycle the city's gray water, which reduces the water footprint used as well. Um, and all of the lower costs and better access to a healthy diet lowers the population that it's feeding, lowers their risks of heart disease, obesity, and diabetes. And that's due to just having like high quality, nutritious foods, um, like as available as, say, like a fast food place. It also reduces chronic unemployment rates. So they provide jobs and stuff like that, which I'll go into more as well. This is an example of a vertical um, farm by Plant Lab. They're based in Holland. It's the largest vertical indoor farming center in the world. And they just opened up some in Indianapolis and the Bahamas. So as you can see, it's just these big giant buildings that they fill with plants, and they can use like vacant buildings and like recycle old buildings in that way. They don't have to like build a whole new lab or whatever. Um, and they just keep them under these lights, and they're able to grow food really efficiently and all year round. So the bio-intensive method is just maximizing the amount of calories you can grow on the smallest amount of land possible. It was modeled after nature, and it just focuses on the production of calories and the reduction of like carbon emissions and things like that. Um, and the interesting thing about this is it prioritizes the farmer and the soil, which is the basis for all of the food that we're growing. So one of the major influential people in this was a man named John Jevons. He is the executive director of Ecology Action, and he was influential in developing the biointensive method, and it's used in 143 countries now. So there's also an initiative or an organization in Kenya, where they called GBIACK, and basically it's just all these people adopting the biointensive method of farming in their communities, and they're using this program in order to also get things like a community library center, um, and improving living standards for those with AIDS and HIV, which is very prevalent in places like Kenya. So basically, the money they make from gardening, they're not only supporting the local economy, but they're also able to raise money for these things. So they also are very invested on getting women into the workforce in this way as well, um, which obviously raises like the overall life standards for the country. So another method is the backyard, community, and nonprofit types of urban farming. And backyard is just you have like this small area and you just want to grow as much as you can. So just another way of using the bio-intensive method. And it's really important to replace your a monoculture lawn that's just grass or whatever, and let like some wildflowers grow. This is really beneficial for the pollinators and just, you know, the overall biodiversity of the area. And there's also an increased biodiversity with seed exchanges, especially with immigrant populations in cities. So crosses between grocery store varieties of sweet corn and like um, maize seeds brought from other places have been found in home gardens, and they're increasing the biodiversity of our food supply in that way as well. Um, and nonprofit community gardens are just gardens on public spaces that are leased to volunteers, and there's also some privately owned ones. But um, yeah, so people can just come in and like lease out a little plot and grow some food. So they also, as I said with the vertical farming, there's the brownfields and vacant lots. So cities often will have like these big empty lots or buildings, whatever it is, that are not only unattractive, but they're unproductive. You can't really use them for anything. So people will lease them out to third parties, and um, basically the people will come in and clean it up and um, you know, establish gardens and things like that. There's a bunch in Baltimore, Detroit, Milwaukee, and the pictures here are from Kansas State University, where they took like a brownfields vacant area, cleaned it up, and turned it into like a little community garden. So there's also the rooftop gardens. In New York, there's Eagle Street Rooftop Farm, and it is a greenhouse just built on top of just a warehouse in Brooklyn. It's been operating since 2009, and they sell a lot of vegetables to local restaurants. And they also like host educational volunteer programs for the schools around New York. And there's also the New York Sunworks, which is a nonprofit organization, and they're building rooftop hydroponic farms around like New York City and schools. And they've already built 43 of these. So that picture is just one of the farms. There's also a lot of environmental benefits to urban gardening as well, obviously, as that's one of the main goals of urban agriculture. So a lot of different methods used, like the vertical farming and even backyard gardens, they recycle the gray water, reducing the carbon footprint. And garden in cities also create sort of a more of an awareness on the environmental impacts of our food system currently. So somebody who may not have even, you know, known anything about it now has the tools to create change, which is also really empowering. Um, and it reduces the negative effects created by our current agriculture methods. So I have some infographics at the bottom as well of open field production, which is like the big, large fields. It currently uses 250 liters, and this is for like individual crops. So of a head of lettuce, or per kilogram of lettuce, it takes 250 liters of water to grow, and it's 2,000 food miles of transportation. Um, and that compared to growing a head of lettuce on a vertical farm, it only uses 1 liter of water. There's only 43 food miles in transportation, all depending on where the vertical farm is located as well. So some of the sociological benefits, there's the assurance of knowing where your food's grown, um, and the time spent in gardening has been shown to sort of alleviate stress and things like that, like just spending more time in green space in general. And also, time spent gardening helps people connect and pass this knowledge down of how to sustain yourself and others from one to another. So there's that connection as well. Um, and the farmers as well have expressed fulfillment with this like direct connect to the people that they're selling the food with. So it's this really strong community that they create this way. Um, farmers reportedly feel more satisfied selling food they work with, or selling the food they work to produce to the people, and they just create long-term relationships that way with their community, and it also alleviates job insecurity and stress and pressure from that. So a little more on the sort of financial and economic benefits. So because the food are available at lower prices due to, the reduced transportation costs, um, or food is available because of that, and again, increased jobs. They need workers on the farms, and like they have a system usually, like an urban farm. If it's not a backyard farm, it will be connected to grocery stores, food markets, farm stands, things like that. So they need workers there. It raises property values, tax revenues, and $70 are saved by those growing it in backyard gardens. And this is just an example of increased jobs. There is in Inglewood, Chicago, there is an organization called Growing Home, and they provide 14-week paid transitional jobs for those who have things like criminal records, housing insecurity, a lack of education or work experience. Um, they just kind of provide that for the people in the community. So another benefit is overall public health. So they're able to meet these nutritional guidelines a lot easier. A single garden plot with some chickens can contribute to 9.2% of protein, 23% of vitamin K, 20% of vitamin C, and the smaller like other nutrients as well. So how much can we grow from these farms? There is an organization called Earthworks, and they are shown to, or they reported that they grew 14,000 pounds of food on just 2.5 acres of land. On 1.5 acres of land, you can grow 37,000 pounds of vegetables as well. It all depends on the method you're using as well. So with just 50 acres at the bottom, it shows all the different things we could grow with the land in Boston. And there was a case study in Fort Collins, Colorado, where they analyzed a 10-foot by 10-foot raised garden bed, and it yielded 18 kilograms of produce per season, with 16% of the recommended 100 kilograms of annual fruit and vegetables. And it yielded about 2.8 kilograms per square meter. So 100% of each resident in the city got the minimum vegetable nutrition from if they use just 18% of the unproductive land by the single family homes. So some of the cons, it's not a significant source of income if you're doing it on like smaller plots and like backyard urban gardens. Individual households don't really see a lot of income coming in compared to the more larger scale like vertical farming. And like I said before, a lot of time needs to be dedicated to this. So areas that are more time poor, they might not have the time to access the resources that are out there for learning how to properly garden. And organizations in charge might not be aware of a community's needs, as I said before, with religious things, ethnic, cultural differences, or just specific nutrients that a community is in need of. So this also, social work comes into play here. So they directly engage with the community, and they're able to sort of be a direct line of communication between organizations and the community. They can provide assessments of their nutritional needs, give resources, and they can determine if residents need more time to prepare these foods, which is, another advantage of having fast food. So they can address all these concerns. So An aspect of implementing urban gardens is zoning. So zoning is just laws that control how public and private lands are used. It helps urban agriculture by dividing the cities into districts and seeing like what each one can be used for. So they have a direct impact on promoting urban agriculture and supporting it as well. So this picture is just an example of like simplified version of some of the more complicated zoning code maps that they have just of what area of land is dedicated to what. So it hinders urban agriculture development because it is restrictive by nature. So a lot of the limits on the land kind of dictate what you can and cannot grow. So uh, it's different everywhere, but some private garden spaces are allowed, but some like growing produce or greenhouses could be restricted as well. And there's also minimum acreage requirements on urban farms, which, you know, is like for the more larger scale ones, yes, that is also a hindrance, but less so for the like smaller scale backyard gardens, which is obviously also on your own property then, But so you may need special vendor licenses as well, like in Berkeley, California. They allow the sale of things like produce, nuts and eggs, but they limit meat sales. There are fire code restrictions on buildings, and also due to just how complicated these zoning codes can be, people become intimidated or overwhelmed, and um, they might either stop development or not reach out just for fear of the negative consequences. So there is a huge need for urban agriculture specific zoning ordinances. So many people are updating their policies and even including how-to guides on how to build an urban garden in your area. So they define terms like urban gardening and urban agriculture um, just to sort of expand how the land is used directly in the codes. There's also a huge need for comprehensive plans in government, which helps establish urban gardens, and it engages the government and the public in creating these sustainable policies because urban agriculture is so um, reliant on um, environmental and sustainable policies. So in Jersey City, an example, they've allowed community gardens, rooftop gardens, raised planters in all zones and redevelopment plan areas on an as of right basis. So um, this just means that as long as the area is compliant to the zoning codes and everything, you don't need any special permits or permissions to use the land. So again, government policies, incentive-based legislation for leasing or occupying these vacant areas. There's an example of California, which passed a bill in 2013, which it allows landowners to donate their vacant or unproductive lands for garden plot use and um, over a 5-year period in exchange for lower tax assessments. So just the benefits of land leasing, with the increasing availability of underused public land is already an issue in cities. So it's just a good way to sort of utilize that, unproductive space and grow something for the community. So again, there is a huge need for sustainability offices. It does so much to support urban agriculture. A bunch of places like Atlanta, Baltimore, Milwaukee, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. all have offices of sustainability. And it also helps it helps when setting up plans for cities. So like I said, with a comprehensive plan, it allows governments to set goals and determine needs. And they're able to like go in depth and can do surveys of the city's actual land, which decides like if it's possible to grow in this area or if the soil is too damaged or something like that, if it needs cleanup, and just any other things that it might need. And it also helps them discover if they need to get in contact with like volunteers at universities or specialists, planners, things like that. So just kind of like an example of how zoning really works to help. Um, Urban agriculture is in New York, and so a little background on it. Mayor Bloomberg saw the city's population. It was becoming more vulnerable and needing sort of these environmental fixes. He recognized that that could really help. So they made that, the people in office made that sort of central to their agenda, and they created a comprehensive plan, and it addressed, growth, equity, sustainability, and all of that within the city. And the features of the plan was water reduction, cleaner air and water, energy efficiency, environmental sustainability, and also a focus on poverty reduction. So all of that's like pretty vague, but a comprehensive plan was it's just put in place to sort of give you these guidelines. So the result is the city is now home to over 600 community gardens, and 80% grow fresh produce either on public or leased/licensed land. And they, have volunteers maintaining it, and um, those who own the private residences work to maintain it as well. So the incentivized green roof construction has, it's with grants and tax stuff that is very complicated. And all of this, the incentivization has just resulted in um, sort of this widespread urban agriculture across the city. The city council passed a bill in 2012 to allow rooftop gardens on non-residential buildings, and it exempted them from zoning height codes and floor area restrictions. So that's just kind of an example of an amendment you could make to benefit urban agriculture. Um, and here's some of the programs and sort of farms that they have. There's the Green Thumb program, which is nationwide, but these two are just two of the gardens they have in New York. There's also Queens and Brooklyn. They have the country's largest and most well-known green rooftop farms. So I have the Eagle Rooftop Farm pictured there, and then they have the vertical and indoor farming as well, which is Edenworks and Square Root in Brooklyn. So there are still issues. There's limitations on nurseries, so for flowers and truck gardens. They're allowed provided that no offensive odors or dust is created, and there's no sale of products not produced on the same zoning lot. So obviously that's, kind of hard to work around, and it's a little, vague who could, decide that. But so also there's sale restriction with other limits that discourage farmers. The temporary license given to volunteer parties places them like at risk of liabilities or anything happening on the farms. So that's kind of a deterrent as well. Rooftop farming in residential areas is restricted, um, as well as impeding homeowners or those in apartments that want to grow food on their, buildings. So, and there's also a restriction on growing and selling produce in the same place. So, it's yeah, it's pretty limited, even though they have made some amendments. But basically, the fixes to this are, an emphasis on amending these zoning codes, and defining terms like that really helps with awareness as well. Um, so there's also urban gardens also played a role in the pandemic. There was kind of like this boom of this increased interest in gardening. I think it like some of the factors in this was the food shortages in grocery stores, people buying things off the shelves, and the disruption in the food supply chain, and also increased isolation. We all know gardening helps so much with your just mental state. It provides connection with others at a safe distance. And growing your own food, it's, you can sort of get your own nutrition, and it's really empowering that way. So it was just an interesting way that people were sort of coping with the pandemic. Um, and yeah, that's it. This is my works cited and all my photos that I have.